Mrs. Alexandra Ellis. She is this upcoming year's president of NALSA. Thank you so much. And what NALSA is we're an organization of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students who are here to promote Indigenous issues while we're at law school and getting our master's degrees. And so I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement, and then Alexandra is going to introduce our wonderful moderator for the evening. We begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the homeland of the Abenaki people, the Indigenous people of Vermont. Alno Bak, Muskijik, Mahalakwa Sikyok, Abenaki people who emerge from the ashtrays. We recognize that the land on which Vermont Law School sits, Coas, is the homeland of the Coassac traditional band of the Coas Abenaki Nation. We further recognize Vermont to be the homeland of 4 additional Indigenous nations, the Elnu Abenaki tribe, the Nulhegan band of the Coosac Abenaki Nation, the St. Francis Sokoke band of the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi, and the Stockbridge Munsee band of Mohican Indians. We say these words thinking of the ancestors, the descendants, and all our relations. Uli Uni, thank you.
I want to first start off and thank Bill Vaughn for doing audio and visual for this event. Thank you, Bill. You've been amazing. Ian Sears and Parker Thurston, I apologize if I said your last name wrong, doing online outreach, really appreciate you. Karen Henderson, who did our amazing graphic design, and Vanessa Davis in food services that will give the lovely meal later in the session, so thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Alana. She wonderfully agreed to be our moderator for tonight, and we couldn't be happier. Alana, how do you say this name? Ojibwe, is the program manager for the Center for Justice Reform at Vermont Law School, which is also home to the National Center on Restorative Justice. Alana received her BA in sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, with a focus on international human rights and sustainable development. Before joining the VLS RJ team, Alana worked within the nonprofit sector, both in Vermont and New York City, focusing on program management and services for issues related to homelessness, substance abuse, domestic and sexual violence, mental health, incarceration, and youth education. Outside of her role with VLS, Alana is also actively involved with her tribal communities of
Sault Ste. Marie.
Thank you for helping me.
Sault Ste. Marie, Anishinaabe in Michigan, as well as the United Huma Nation of Louisiana. Was that right? Okay.
Good, thank you. Some of the volunteer work she is currently most passionate about is working alongside a team of other young women with the I so apologize. Language project to collect oral histories from tribal elders and document these stories, preserve and share with future generations. Well, thank you, Wadu, and I'd like to put the event over to you. Thank you.
Bonjour, alitu, hello and greetings. Thank you all for joining here today in person and for those who are joining us virtually. And most sincere thanks to you, Patrick, Frank, and Hillary. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. I want to start also by thanking NALSA and the Food and Ag Society for the planning and coordination of this event and for inviting me to moderate. It's a real honor and privilege to be here with the three of you, and we're excited to talk more. So I will begin by introducing our three panelists, and then from there we'll go into a few prepared questions, but also we'll invite questions from those of you in attendance. And for those who are joining virtually, you are able to submit questions through the YouTube channel if you're streaming, and can submit those questions from there, so we will stay tuned. Can I just, sorry, I'm gonna just adjust the screen. I like being able to see faces. Sorry.
No, it's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to see your faces. So the first panelist I would like to introduce is Hillary Renick. Hillary is an enrolled member of the Sherwood Valley Band of Pomo Indians and descendant of the Hopland, Chanel, Noyo River, and Fort McDermott Paiute Shoshone communities. Hillary has over 25 years of service to the federal government and tribal communities, and currently serves as the Tribal Liaison Coordinator for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, within the U.S. Department of Interior. Through this work, Hillary advises BOEM leadership on implementing tribal consultation policies through formal and informal dialogue, collaboration, and engagement. Thank you for joining, Hillary. Next, we are joined by Patrick Anderson, who comes from the Tlingit tribe of Alaska. Patrick is an attorney, health administrator, and tribal manager. Patrick is one of 4 Alaska Native attorney members living in Alaska when he joined the bar in 1978. Patrick most recently served as the CEO of Alaska Rural Cap and has been a longtime board member of Sealaska Corporation. Patrick's work focuses on rural Alaska communities and the reduction of intergenerational trauma, particularly childhood trauma. And finally, we are also joined by Frank Bibeau. Frank is an enrolled member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe and lives on the Leech Lake Reservation. Frank's legal work focuses on the treaty rights of tribes and members to help protect the natural resources for future generations. Frank represented Honor the Earth in Sandpiper pipeline proceedings, currently Line 3 pipeline proceedings at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. Thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you. So to start, we have a few questions that I'd like to invite the 3 of you to share, and then we have a few particular questions for individually. But to start, I'm wondering if you could share a story a bit behind the why of how you got involved to this work and what inspired your path into law. So I may, if it's okay, pass to you first, Hillary.
Sure. Welcome, everyone. We can't see. All we can see is you, the moderator. That's great. So for me personally, it's my deep, family connections. On my mother's side, my grandmother was born a prisoner of war of the United States. Her band resisted encroachment and did not go to the reservations until the turn of the last century. And so knowing my family lines, my chiefs come from Chief Winnemucca, Chief Truckee, just being proud of who I am. And through my whole process, my undergrad is cultural anthropology. I have a graduate degree in natural resource management. And just through the whole process of higher education, taking what I was taught since I was a baby in my baby basket to adulthood, and then through law school, finding out that everything I was told as a child was true, right? So like you're indoctrinated, through undergrad into being, whatever discipline that you are, then in grad school, it's kind of like you're testing that hypothesis, right? Is that right? Critical thinking skills. Then in law school, just to look at, constitutional law, property law, federal Indian law, environmental law, and figuring out the patchwork of how we got to today. So for me, I was influenced by just being proud of the chiefs, my family line, and wanting to respect and honor them. And the whole process of coming from fisher people and the usufruct, the easement on the land that may not be on the title, always told that, we have the Aboriginal rights to continue to subsist don't stop, but through indoctrination, we're told that's all wrong. And then through the process of law school told, then learning, that was right. So just that really deep connection to the landscape, to the cultural landscape, and wanting to respect and honor ancestors going backwards and then descendants going forward.
Thank you so much. And I'll pass it over to Patrick.
Thank you. I put a link in the chat, and I did that so that I don't have to spend much time explaining who I am. So anyone who is interested in finding out a little bit about my background is welcome to read that. My actually being interested in law is kind of a very different story than Hillary's. I didn't grow up with my culture. I left when I was about 4.5 years old from the Tlingit culture. I went to my father's people, the Aleut culture, and left just before my 9th birthday. When I got to the Seattle area, we had our first exposure to television. And this may not mean much to the rest of you students, but there was a very popular TV show on called Perry Mason. I used to watch it with my mother. And when I was 11 years old, I just told her, I said, Mom, I want to be a lawyer. Then she kept reminding me of that until I went off to college. And then I realized that I either would have to go to work after graduating from college or I could go to law school. And since a lot of my friends were going to law school, I thought this might be a good career. Subsequently went to law school at the University of Michigan. When I graduated, and you'll get this background in the article if you read it, having come out of a poverty background, it was more important for me to actually be able to pay off my loans, to be able to live and to survive and to have a home. So I practiced law. And when I did arrive in Alaska, there were only 2 practicing attorneys. One was a judge, the other was actually practicing. 2 others had retired, left the state. One of my Tlingit colleagues and I took the bar exam in 1978. I passed on my first try. And so I jokingly tell people that once we passed the bar exam, Norm and I doubled the size of the Alaska Native Bar. I had also been at the University of New Mexico's summer law program. And that was one of probably the first 5 or 6. So I got a chance to meet Native law students from all over the country. So that's basically why I became a lawyer. And then I'll leave the rest of the time for you to ask questions. You're the important ones here.
Right.
Thanks so much, Patrick. And Frank.
Well, Bourgeois, it's interesting listening to those 2 stories. I suppose mine's similar to that in ways, but I grew up all over the United States and mostly the United States. My father was in the service. And so being probably closer in age to Patrick there, the Chippewa, as you know, Ojibwe, there was Wounded Knee, there was Alcatraz. I mean, you can go down the list, the takeover of the Department of Interior in DC. I grew up outside DC. So it was always troubling for me because I didn't understand what the real issues were. If everything was written down, why it couldn't be understood. And so it always stuck in my mind that way. And I worked for the Indian Ojibwe News there for about, 15 years with Bill Lawrence before I even went to law school. And so I was already an older student. I was already 38 when I went to law school. I already had a whole bunch of Indian questions. And law school didn't have hardly any answers. And so it was kind of troubling in that regard. I saw it as kind of a big library card, helping you understand where to research, because they couldn't explain answers to my questions as a tribal member on the reservation. And it was kind of troubling, that you go to law school and they don't know the answers. And so I've had to invest a lot of time, and that's been good because I live on the reservation. My relatives live there, a lot of poverty in some of these reservations. We have probably 20,000 members at the White Earth Band, another 10 at Leech Lake, another 10 at Red Lake. Very, very large Indian community. Minnesota itself is number 2, I think, population-wise for Indians in Minneapolis and things. So So I worked for legal services. I worked for public defenders because it's the poverty that, in my mind, that holds us back. We don't know how to access our rights very well. We don't know how to use our defenses very well. And so early on, after I got my bachelor's degree, I met Winona LaDuke. And well, we've been friends ever since, most of our lives. And Winona's kind of like in charge of me now and for some time, and very, very dynamic person. And so, you know, interestingly enough, and it's a part of being attorneys, you know, you're in a world that you don't always know who's who. But part of the reason I'm doing what I'm doing is about 25, probably more than that now, years ago, Winona LaDuke ran for vice president with Ralph Nader in 1996 and again in 2000. And one of the people that she worked with, Tom Lindsay, does the Center for Environmental Democratic Rights, or however you say, CEDAR there. And so her and Tom have known each other a long time. We were trying to figure out our defenses against Line 3 and watching Standing Rock and watching KXL and things like that. And so I was tasked with trying to come up with an alternative method to protect wild rice, to protect water, and to protect the water protectors themselves. And so I've created some things that haven't been created before, and they're kind of working right now, and we'll talk about those things, but we may have found a system outside the system that's been holding us down for a long time.
Thank you all so much. And as you all can hear, just in the why behind this work, there's a lot of differences among these three and really incredible things that the three of you have done and continue to do. So I'm wondering if next you could speak to, knowing that there's so much variety in the practice that the three of you do, could you share one aspect, maybe a particular project of your work that you're most excited about right now? And what do you hope to see in next steps of progress related to that? And again, you can start with Hillary.
Sure. Well, for me, right out of law school, I really didn't have much mentorship. So I did what I thought I was supposed to do. And I became a tribal judge, and I was working in the criminal justice system, and I ended up hating it. And so, but I was a single mother, and I had to pay the bills. So there was no time that I could just, ponder what I wanted to do with my life. Life happens, and you got to keep up. And also, like, similar to Frank, and also being surrounded by poverty, right? So like I had it bad, but everyone around me had it worse. So there was no one to complain to. At least I had a ladder in front of me, right? And so I could start climbing that ladder. So for me, personally, it was kind of like a journey when you come from, blue collar working class people, you're always told to work, right? And so once I got to be like a tribal judge, then I had nobody then to look up to, because I was like at that top of that tier. And so, just like really working myself to death. And so it was super unhealthy. And, then having to step out of that role and kind of figure out, as I just like other people in tribal communities, having to take care of my parents at the end of their lives, gave me time to figure out what I wanted to do, because my student loans, I still have them. Like they're not going anywhere. And so, again, not complaining, because my, extended family and people in my community have a tougher time than I do. So I, never could really complain or anything like that. But, so for me, I did like a big circle going back to like cultural resources and working with traditional knowledge, writing documents where researchers coming into tribal communities, they're always resource extractive, right? We want your DNA. We want all your sacred stuff. We want to know where your most precious traditional plants are, your medicines, but usually the tribal communities don't get anything back. So for me, taking that tribal lens and balancing it with, the tools of the law and coming up with documents where I feel like, I'm helping tribal communities push back on resource extractive methodologies and with climate change, more folks, they want that native knowledge, but they, not everyone deserves access to not just tribal communities, but vulnerable communities period. So trying to push back for me, really giving back. And you know what, the stuff for me, the heart stuff doesn't really pay, honestly, but I feel good about it. And I feel better than I did then as being a tribal judge with, seeing family law issues and ICWA and all this very heavy duty stuff, super important. Somebody needs to do it, but finding my place of where I could give back, working on traditional food, working on with, trying to protect what little we have, I guess.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it over to Patrick.
Frank gave away the fact that we're getting older. And I reflect back on my career. I had the opportunity to sit as a student board member on the Association on American Indian Affairs at the time they were considering the Indian Child Welfare Act. So I got to listen to some of the great lawyers, Indian lawyers of the day, and they were all white. There were no American Indian, Alaska Native lawyers there. I don't disrespect their interest and their integrity. They did a fantastic job, but there were very few of us. We'd not yet had the opportunity to climb that ladder that Hillary was talking about to be respected. I had an opportunity to work for the Honorable Stuart Udall, who in Alaska implemented the Alaska Native Land Claim Settlement Act because he stopped land activities up here. He just put an embargo on any kind of actions or activities. So I saw the power that law had, but I also saw, because two of my peers chose not to practice law, that you didn't have to be an actual practitioner. I chose to be a practitioner. I've tried civil cases. I've tried criminal cases. I arrived at the point that Hillary arrived at, which is I hated it. I had one client who engaged in litigation against their CEO, a Native man, spent $13-14 million on it and lost the case, drove my colleague to bankruptcy. I have seen the bad side of tribal politics. I was around when the Navajo Nation had a president that extorted funds and got convicted for it. I myself had one individual tribal president who stole money from her tribe. I was branded the bad guy because at that point I had made a transition into managing organizations, and I withheld small tribes funding from her tribe because I did not want to be responsible or accountable for her lack of transparency in their finances. She ended up being sentenced to 3 years in federal prison because of her actions and activities. And so I did my stint as an actual practicing attorney. The BIA wouldn't hire me, which is probably a great thing. I applied twice, once as an area director, and then I moved off into a different area. And Frank's tribe is an early entry, an innovator in this space, and that was the White Earth Brain Conference. It's been going on for a couple of decades now. And I was making the transition from, I guess, a doer
cause analysis. And let's see, did my microphone give out? Can you still hear me?
For a second.
Okay. And a root cause analysis. And then I began to see that there was great power in thinking rather than doing. So I tell my boys, for example, that you're not going to make much progress until you begin to hire people to do work. You do it yourself. You have income from one person. You hire 100 people and they make you $5,000 a year, that's when you're most productive. But if you're a thinker, like an act, if you have a number of individuals who are working with you, that you can make greater progress. So I went into this whole world of understanding childhood acquired trauma, of adverse childhood experiences, and the behaviors that come along with it. So there's just a lot of room for someone trained as an attorney to be working in. But my goal right now is to come up with proof for what I've styled a restoration to health hypothesis that can begin to heal Indian country from the childhood acquired traumas that I believe are really a root cause of the poverty that we spoke about, the lack of innovation and creativity that we have, and then some of the dysfunctional behaviors like were exhibited by the tribal president that ended up doing a prison term. So not sure if that was responsive, but it's where I'm at right now.
That was perfect. Thank you so much. And Frank.
Okay, well, I'll try to stay closer to the answer of the question there. No, I'm kidding. There's two or three things but the most present thing that I think most people are interested in is the rights of Gnomon. And again, that goes back to Tom Lindsay and Cedar and also CELDEF. He was working with Center for Environmental Legal Defense Fund for a long time too. And so the rights of Gnomon was a hard start for me. Winona really wanted to have rights of a river. The Mississippi River, where the Chippewas of the Mississippi, were woodland, were canoe people, were fishing people, were wild rice people. And so as I was talking with Winona on different occasions about how to try to implement rights of a river, at the Mississippi, we probably have 30 dams and water controls that the Corps of Engineers has. And that's our oldest enemy, the US Army. I mean, I couldn't figure out how to get any control over them, what remedy I might get or anything. And that's what I told her. And I don't know, she just said, well, what about rights of Gnomon? And I said, well, that's a no-brainer, because wild rice is in our 1837 treaty specifically. It says that we reserve the rights to hunt, fish, and gather wild rice on the lands and the lakes and the waters, the rivers that are being ceded. That's huge. And so in reality, having wild rice, which is very unique as a treaty being the supreme law of the land language for harvesting wild rice, that was really big. And so I started working with rights of Gnomon, and we worked through it. We got it adopted in 2018. The White Earth Band adopted one for on-reservation. These were part of the strategies for Line 3 to protect the water and the wild rice. And ultimately, during the Line 3 construction, we had a drought going on, and the DNR wasn't doing their job properly, which, you know, I don't want to see any shocked faces out there. But the DNR didn't know that Enbridge had breached an aquifer and was leaking millions of gallons of water. And they didn't know for months because Enbridge didn't want to disclose it, because they were afraid if they did, DNR might have to shut them down, and the water protectors would show right up where that problem was and would bring national attention. And so they intentionally kept it hidden for about 5 months, from January until May. And then when they did disclose it to the DNR gave them a 5 billion gallon dewatering permit retroactively, you know, which is like saying, okay, we know you committed a crime, but we're going to try to help you make it look like it's legal. Well, that's all well and good for everybody but the Indians. And this happened essentially, the last parts of it were in August, right at ricing season. The water was down in the rivers, and we were down to the lake on White Earth, which is reserved in the treaty. It's been restored by the federal government. It's, you know, I mean, I can go on and on about the wild rice significance there. And the people couldn't get their canoes out onto the lake because there was no water to even harvest the wild rice on one of our most important and long guarded wild rice lakes. And that's when I filed against the DNR. And, you know, sometimes you develop a strategy that's a little outside the box, and maybe a little further outside the box, and you're not sure where it's going to go yourself. And I remember that my co-counsel, Joe Plummer, we've been attorneys and friends for a long time. And I told him, I said, I needed a little help, you know, and he says, well, I'll help you. He says, but I'm not sure what this all does, you know, but you had to launch it. And simply by launching it really kind of caught the world off guard more than maybe even I thought. And the part that's so interesting for Indian law, and they teach you this stuff a little bit, but they don't connect all the dots. But the DNR, they just presumed that the 11th Amendment protected them and applied to us. And in Indian law, you're taught that the amendments, they don't just attach and apply to us, it's for everybody else. And so the DNR had no idea that they had no defense against what we had done. And it was a real pleasure to sit in the federal court. DNR didn't like being sued in tribal court. They immediately tried to get out of it. They immediately wanted to do a motion to dismiss for lack of subject matter jurisdiction. I do those all the time for state law, so I understood what they were doing. But before we even got to much of a decision, as soon as the judge ruled for jurisdiction against the DNR, they went to federal court. Now, in law school, I thought you were only supposed to have like law going on in one court most of the time, but the DNR goes right over there because they didn't like it. And at the hearing, Judge Wilhelmina Wright, she was on the bench there, and the guy from DNR, she asked him, can you cite to any law that gives me the authority to tell the tribal court they can't exercise jurisdiction against you? And the DNR stood there quietly. And that's when I knew I had him by the toe. And that, and that's it. They don't know how to get out of it. Now, unfortunately, I might be too far ahead of the curve, and our White Tribal Court of Appeals couldn't understand what we were doing. And they said that the court had ruled wrong and had dismissed the case, which caught everybody off guard because usually they have a little deference for the lower court, but they started trying to figure out federal Indian law, and that wasn't their job. And so we had to help them kind of step back a little bit, look at what our law says, look what our jurisdiction says, are we functioning inside of our box? And so that's what's going on right now. That also caused a hiccup with the federal court because we've already seen a couple of cases that were argued the same day on December 16th have come out with decisions. There was another one from Standing Rock that was argued December 13th. That came out. There was a young man who had an eye socket that was busted from some of the brutality in a 1983 thing. And so this Gnomon versus DNR, especially for those of us who have Chippewa treaty rights, I think it's going to change everything. I think it's going to change everything for our waters and for our protection. And then I think the other tribes will be able to argue more like a reserved rights doctrine. Had we known we had to do this, we would have done this too. And so I think that some of the unique rights that we have would have been reserved that way had we known. One of the things I created for water protectors along with this was the right to travel, use, and occupy traditional lands and water codes, because otherwise the state uses state law against you. And if you don't have something else to substitute and point to, even if you have to wait till you get to federal court, you're going to be prosecuted under state law completely. And so that was another aspect of this. And so I like what Rights of Gnomon has been doing. It makes every Ojibwe and Anishinaabe person very happy to see Gnomon sue the DNR. And that was magical by itself. I mean, that's why I'm here.
That was great. All a lot of different things that were that you shared, and actually you said something, Frank, that kind of segues into the next question for the three of you. So we have this group here with us today, combination of master's and JD students, some in their first year, second year, third year. So a few of you had mentioned this explicitly, but Frank, you said around sort of maybe what either is totally absent in law education or maybe given in a way, but not totally connecting the dots. So on the theme of that, if the three of you, in thinking about sort of your own experience in law school and in law education, if you could change something today that would become a part of legal education for students across the country, if you could make a class or something that should be a part of a class, what would you suggest that's important for students to be learning?
Are we back to Frank, or are you going to Hillary?
Well, it looks like you're spotlighted, so let's start with you.
Oh. Well, again, I kind of go back to another time when we had what do you call the core youth corps and things with Kennedy and things. You know, we've had a lot of young law students when we were doing our public defender stuff and our legal services. We preferred to get law students right out of law school before their brains were put into a box and told what you can't do, because we were thinking outside the box all the time. And those young people, when they came and saw the power of treaty rights, even if it only happened once or twice while they were doing it, they could see that there was another way. And so that was part of what I guess I was looking for, was another way. The part that's helped me the most, I guess, I was doing legal services, and you know, you got to figure out the best answer with the least amount of money for the most amount of people, which, you know, is like the opposite of law, where you get one person who has $14 million to lose, right, Patrick? So I got just lost there for a second. Oh, so with the legal services, I met a guy who's doing the Sauk Seattle tribe litigation against the city of Seattle for the rights of salmon. And he turned me on to a case called Shmishkin. And Shmishkin is out in Idaho. It started in Idaho and in Washington with the Yakima band. And so there was a father-son that was smuggling cigarettes from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho into Yakima. Washington wanted to get at the taxes that they thought they owed. And ultimately, the Ninth Circuit decided that their treaty right, the right to bring their goods to market on the public roadway. I mean, that's a pretty simple sentence. Until you're running cigarettes from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, right into Yakima and selling them without state tax on them. And they said that treaty right in that section beat out the Homeland Security Act, the Smuggling Act, and the Cigarette Contraband Trafficking Act. And so we use that same logic with what they called Square Hook in Minnesota, where they thought we had some fish netting ring. And there were Indians netting fish and selling fish, but they were all working for themselves individually. We're trappers, we don't have a ring. And so they were selling them to people, and we were able to show that our treaty rights beat out the Lacey Act. And so now we've also used our treaty rights to beat out the OSHA. OSHA can't give you a fine under Scalia, a case called Scalia, not the other guy. And so even as of right now, because of what I've figured out, and whether I'm right or not, we'll find out, but I have my own tax case in the US tax court because I sit as an election judge. I'm working with defending our natural resources. And I believe those two things are so intrinsic and internal to our form of government, self-governance, self-determination, food sovereignty, food security, you can go down the list, that I shouldn't have to pay taxes to the other people on the other side who's destroying everything I'm trying to protect. It just doesn't make sense. And so I think I can win on environmental jurisdiction for my income, and I can win on as an election judge. And so I'm trying to carve out another area because of poverty. How do you make it so people aren't taxed? How do they get to keep their money? How do they get to spend their money? And so one of the things we did at Leech Lake, because we're not a very wealthy group, we created a once a year $200 per cap payment. I think it's $300 now. It's not very much, but what happened was the state of Minnesota revenue wanted everybody to pay taxes on it, or if they were receiving welfare, they wanted to declare it as new income so the state didn't have to pay out as much welfare to those recipients. But we made it a tax rebate like Jesse the Body Ventura had done as a governor in Minnesota. And so by making it a tax rebate, essentially we were giving you money back that technically you would have paid in the year before. So it wasn't new income. And so it was an economic stimulus to all the poor people who were tribal members in all the communities around the reservation. All the county attorneys and county boards and all, they thought it was great. We were putting $1.5 million right into the local economy through the poorest people. And they went to the stores. St. Paul wants our money, you know? So it's a question, how do people understand, how are we helping? We were helping by putting the money in our poor communities, whether you're Indian or not. St. Paul wants everybody to give it up. More? Next.
All right, let's toss it over to Hillary.
Yeah, so man, you can't argue with Frank. He's bringing up wrestlers and politicians. And so I really like the rights of the wild rice. So for us in California, we have 109 federally recognized tribes, about 55 non-recognized tribal nations. And so because of the gold rush, we do not have any ratified treaties. And so, so sometimes it works okay for us because when we have folks coming from other states, mainly Washington State and Oregon come through, they just assume we have treaty rights. And so sometimes they leave us alone. But over the last couple of years during quarantine, we did have the state Fish and Game start doing surveillance on our fishing and hunting areas and started triangulating our phone. And so we've had a lot of subsistence fishermen and hunters get pulled into court a day before the state couldn't file anymore, right? So they had a year to file. One day before, just blanketed, a summons to appear in court for alleged poaching out of season, poaching and transportation of fish out of season. And during the quarantine, especially, the importance of traditional fish or foods specifically became so important because people are sick or they're scared of getting sick. The most vulnerable population, the elders, people in nursing homes, they wanted acorn mush, they want salmon, they want deer, elk. And a lot of these places, the subsistence people, the most vulnerable, maybe they don't have a 9-to-5, not only because some people say, well, they just need to get a job, but it's like 3 hours to the main road, right? It's windy roads. And then, there's this invisible veil of racism and those rural counties targeting Native American people. Even though this is California, sometimes some of my colleagues from other places, my partner is Potawatomi from Kansas, and he says, I always thought California was so liberal. You guys had it made. Don't you guys, have a bunch of casinos and stuff? Well, some, right? Some, 3 or 4 out of the 109 do okay. But they're still inundated by all these other policies. And those are the folks that are most, closer to the larger cities. They have other issues, right? Of squatters and so for if there was something we could do, at least for our area, it would be just the understanding, even though we don't have treaties, just understand that we have the right to life, included the right to water, the right to harvest, the right, because we're getting salmon for our families. We're not getting 1,000 pounds, and we're getting nowhere near our historical numbers. But just the importance of our traditional foods, that especially now, I know many places are having their 6th COVID wave right now. We have a lot of funerals right now. At those ceremonies, the traditional foods are what we want to send our loved ones down, their last boat ride down the river, their last, just near and dear, things that are near and dear to your heart. At the end of the day, who are you? Who what is our legacy on this earth? And what do we stand for? And, common thing across Indian country is our foods. We've been trading them on interstate, rivers and highways for millennia, and we still do.
All right,
I guess
we're waiting for that course to come out first. And Patrick, thank you so much.
Yeah, I guess, make sure I'm not on mute. I guess that leads to me in a very different environment because we don't have treaties ratified or unratified. We didn't become a state until 1959. That was in the middle of the termination era, so the federal government wasn't going to recognize a whole bunch of tribes at that point, although
under the Wheeler-Howard Act, we had a variety of IRA councils. But growing up in an environment that did not have tribes, did not have enforceable rights, didn't have to deal with a lot of the drama that occurred as a consequence of that, I have a very different perspective on things. I think there are two things that a law student should probably do. One was introduced to me by Professor Whitmore Gray at the University of Michigan, and I was too dumb to realize it. Whit taught international law. I did not realize at the time that international law really developed in the Caribbean and in Central America, in the Mayan experience, the Indian experience, and with various debates and discussions between the Catholic Church and those that were adopting the Indian point of view. So we see books like Louis Hankey's Aristotle and the American Indian, and we see books being written about Bartolomé de las Casas and the debates that he had with Juan de Sepúlveda, all of which would have been fascinating to me. I actually had a chance to meet one of the premier anthropologists of Mayan history, Michael Coe, and I didn't know enough to really ask him about the Maya. I would have, now I'm a student of Mayan culture and history, not so much because they built pyramids, but because they had such an advanced culture that did not survive. So that's the first thing that I would look at. The second is that we are not a static people. We should be dynamic. We have native corporations, 12 of them here in Alaska, that deliver about 15 billion in revenue. They're run predominantly by a native figurehead and by non-native business people. My own corporation is not even headquartered in Alaska. It's headquartered in Washington State and has businesses all over the world, so it's not contributing to our economy. I became a student of a management system that was developed by Toyota, and it is, as a part of business history, not yet well adopted within business schools around the country. But what has happened is that Toyota, coming out of a war-torn country, but with a very intact culture, has become the largest automotive company in the world. I look at American Indians and Alaska Natives. We come out of a culture that was war-torn, and yet we have not advanced in terms of our business practices. I cannot even get my own organization to adopt these principles. The Indian Health Service would not adopt this lean management system for healthcare, although they talked about it frequently. So those are the two things that I would do, is to have a cultural grounding in international law, perhaps one written more for American Indians and Alaska Natives than for white people, because that part of Mayan history, that part of that 1500s after the invasion of non-native people into Central America is critical and important. And I think about what Frank is talking about. You know, that's the foundation. International law is the foundation of what we should be practicing. And in terms of business, I look to the Mississippi Choctaw and how well they did and how much better they could have done had they had business practitioners, including business lawyers, who understood this whole new world of performance quality improvement that's been around for 100 years, but we've not yet adopted it. So I'm sorry I put in two classes. You asked for one, but I'm passionate about both of those, so I had to mention them both. And Hillary made me hungry for lots of different foods. My ancestors used to walk down to San Francisco from Yakutat, and I'm pretty sure we got feasted along the way. So.
Thank you so much. So I have one more question for the three of you, and then I want to pause and open up questions that folks here may have. So again, some of you have touched on this in different ways or have certainly mentioned this in your work, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how ideas of interconnectedness and reciprocity influence what justice looks like in many tribal communities. And how does that differ from state and federal models of justice? And I should maybe just rephrase that by saying, what are some things that state and federal systems of justice could learn from an understanding, a better understanding of what an interconnected and relational way of being would look like. And maybe we'll switch the order since Patrick, once again, you're still spotlighted, so maybe we start with you.
Okay. Alaska has, like most of Indian country, a large poverty population. And so the Lyndon Johnson started War on Poverty in 1964-65 has been up here for ages. And I was the CEO of the only agency working statewide on poverty issues, and learned that only about 5% of people who live in poverty make it up to the next level. Very few escape from it. As I've looked at, and again, this goes into historical trauma that morphs into intergenerational trauma, that unless we solve that problem, we're not going to find our way out of poverty as a people. And so what I see is that Native people in Alaska, for example, 39% of our prison population are Alaska Native men. Last time I checked, women were about 11%. If you have a felony or if you have a domestic violence type crime, there are barrier crime laws that apply to you. You can't really climb out into good jobs at that point. It's hard for you to find employment as a felon to begin with, but a barrier crime even keeps you out of a lot of tribal jobs. When I look at emerging from historical racism, it's reemerging. I thought with Brown v. Board of Education, we were on a pathway out of it, but I see with the Trump presidency that we have jumped right back into it, and now it's a lot more overt. And we not only have to look at federal government relationships, but if you're in one of the states that is trying to eliminate your vote, eliminate your participation, that makes it even more difficult. So I'm not seeing a whole heck of a lot of reciprocity. I think Frank stated it real well when he talked about the taxation issues. Through the tribal compacting here in Alaska, we probably bring another $6-7 billion into the state that takes care of healthcare issues. The state of Alaska fought us for ages and still is somewhat on recognition of tribes, despite the fact that our native corporations bring in about $15 billion in revenue. And that's not net revenue, it's not profit, but that does provide a lot of employment for Alaska. And then we look at the nonprofit and the compacting area, it is huge. So I don't see a lot of reciprocity. I see a lot of fighting, resisting, and a lot of it is not well thought of. So that would be the point I make, and we're going to be running out of time, so I'll go ahead and hand it off to the next one.
And maybe pass it over to Frank.
Okay. Well, at first I was thinking about something different for interconnectedness, but the reciprocity piece, we have a lot of that in Minnesota, and it could probably go right into Wisconsin and Michigan, certainly in the past. When I was a lot younger, I was a participant, my wife and I, in the spearing rallies in Wisconsin back in the 80s. And when I was a tribal attorney on Leech Lake is probably, besides there's 5 or 6 big lakes in Minnesota that are premier lakes. Leech Lake is one of them, Red Lake's another, Mille Lacs Lake's another. It's ironic that that's where the Indians live. It's just a coincidence because it's a fishery. So the state has an agreement with us at Leech Lake to where we get 5% off the top of the hunting and fishing licenses that they sell. And then those non-Indians or whoever buys those licenses can come on the Leech Lake Reservation and fish. But in reality, when we go off reservation with our snowmobiles or our boats or canoes, they want us to have their state sticker on it. They don't like reciprocity at all. And occasionally someone gets tagged someplace. And then inevitably it comes back to the reservation for that tribal member because they say, hey, I thought our stickers were good everywhere, which they are. And so then you have to talk to the state, and the state says, well, you know, we don't have a reciprocity agreement. I say, that's right. You have the right to come to our reservation and fish. Where's your boat permit? And the conversation goes very quiet because all of a sudden they realize that's not part of our agreement. You can hold a fish pole, but you got to do it from the shore. And so reciprocity suddenly becomes enlightenment to them, and they dismiss our charge. They don't fix the problem ever because they don't want to. And so it happens all the time. So social justice isn't going to happen in my mind, at least not with the people who are representing the state, when they're representing the state. So for me, I tend to be more, I don't want to say it the wrong way, but I tend to be more of a fighter. And, you know, I'm tired of this stuff. I mean, they don't have the right to do what they're doing. The law's not behind them, and they're just arrogant and have the guns and the badges. And so we're getting closer. Not only do we have more attorneys, but we have a lot more people in law enforcement, a lot more people in conservation, a lot more people with guns and badges ourselves. And I think things are going to change in that regard. And, you know, you talk about that in a weird way with social justice. And so when DAPL was finally got to court, and the federal judge looked at it and she said, hey, you guys didn't do the EIS right. You have to shut that pipeline down. You have to clean it out. And we're going to visit about what should have been done on this EIS. Well, unfortunately, you know, Enbridge and DAPL gave her the finger and said, we're going to continue to pump oil, and we continue to pump oil today. And so we're in that same boat. And we're in that same boat for two reasons. We're in that same boat because we thought we got the luck of the draw for Line 3 when we got the same judge as the DAPL judge, because we liked the order she issued. But from a judge's point of view, and I'm sure Hillary might say something different or the same, her order was being disrespected. So we have been waiting on an accelerated case since December of 2020. It's now 18 months from a TRO application against Enbridge. They've got their pipeline in and they're pumping oil, and we still don't have an order from that judge. Now, I suspect she feels like she doesn't know what to say or do because the other order is being disrespected. Now, for me as a fighter, and the description I gave, if she issued that same order for us, while I don't know what I really can do or not do, my first thought is you take that order and you register it at the White Earth Tribal Court. You take that order and you register it at the Red Lake Tribal Court. And then you order your conservation officers to go out and shut down that pipeline with that federal order, and they've got guns and badges. And you do it as a conservation protection measure with the powers that we do have. But when you're out in Dakota, they're very oppressed people. And they don't believe that they have those powers. But we do, and we do believe it. We're just waiting on that order as well. There's a bunch of things we're ready to do, because if we don't start pressing it, and if we don't take it head on, it's going to get worse. We've got Line 3 thermal imaging flyovers that show a lot more aquifer breaches and a lot more frac outs. The DNR wants to say there's nothing to see here, go home. We're having to do the work that no one else wants to do anymore or can't afford to do anymore. So you have to become an environmental steward, and you have to force it on people. So reciprocity, hopefully they'll catch up and understand why they want to work with us again in the future. Social justice, we'll see. Probably take a couple more head whacks. Interconnectedness, yeah, they're our family too, but it's Cain and Abel with them, you know?
Thank you. Hillary.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking of the distinction. It's so different in the state system versus the tribal system. And the only thing I could really think of is just the worldview, right? So because the states are so new relatively, just their quote unquote justice looks so different. So with tribes, even though, some folks say, well, there's 500, and 74 tribal nations. Well, that's nothing compared to what it used to be, right? So, but in the tribal lens, we're looking long term, right? So you're looking backwards many generations, the present and in the future. So when you're looking at what quote unquote justice, it takes a different, you're using different tools when you're talking about community development, your community, right? So when you're prosecuting something, when you're working, with family law or different administrative actions, you're looking long term, right? So some tribes have like the peacemakers court, some have like different drug courts. There's different other ways to do things because those are your people long term. You don't just toss them out. And so when you're looking at relationship building with anything long term, you use a different lens, right? So the state system, depending on the state, of course, toss away the key, lock them up if they're gone, right? And so, but in the tribal system, we're stuck with the whole family, the extended family, generations of family, right? So what do we do with that? When you're looking long-term, when you're thinking 100 years in the future, which is nothing on a tribal scale. And so it's just different. And so I don't know if like the two of those, maybe they're just so inherently different that's the rub there, right? It's just completely different way of looking at it, looking at society. And so I, don't even know like if you can line them up, right? I mean, that's, it's complicated.
Well, thank you so much. I think it looks like we have our wonderful cafe staff has made some wonderful food. We've got fry bread and Gnomon for you all to try or have again. So maybe we'll take just a quick 3 to 5 minute pause if you all want to grab some food, and then we can come back for questions from you all. Sound good? Are you all okay to hang tight for a couple minutes? I'm sorry, we cannot yet be at a point to send this to you through the screen.
Yeah, I'm fine.
All right, we'll take a quick pause. If you want to stay in your seat and keep eating, I'm happy to relay the question as well. Go ahead, come on. Sure.
Hello, speakers. My name is Clara. Frank, hello, it's good to meet you virtually today. Frank, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about Gnomon. The part of the meal that we're having right now is wild rice that was harvested. It was either by Red Lake or Leech Lake. I'm not sure which one. So you could share a little bit about Gnomon and the Anishinaabe migration story, and just so we have some context of what we're enjoying right now.
Okay, well, thank you. And that's probably a good idea. So Gnomon or wild rice, Gnomon is the word we use for good berry. And it seems odd in a way, but it's something we gather. It's like a berry, I suppose. And it really is probably the best and most important one. When there was a discussion earlier, I think Hillary was talking, you talk about a trade commodity, wild rice is it. Wild rice, it can be stored for years. And if you know where you're storing it, in Minnesota, where I'm more familiar with it, and the glaciers and things like that, the glaciers created these like berms, we call them pine islands. And so they're mostly east to west. They're probably like 20 feet high, and they go up and then they go down. And then there's a swamp, and then they go up and they go down. But because of the way they lay, the wind hits the backside and goes up, and the south side gets all the sun. And we have a lot of sugar sand, so you could bury your cache of wild rice and maybe sugar from maple and things like that. So wild rice is part of our spiritual teachings, in the sense that there was prophecies about going to where the food grows on the water. And so where you are as the Abenaki, ideally we came through all of the Great Lakes, and we didn't do it in one summer. It took a few generations, and finally we got probably even to Michigan and found wild rice. But ultimately we came all the way to Minnesota. Now, if I was as slick as other people, I'd show you some maps while I'm talking, but I'll just talk about them. And so there's these old Birch Maps. I have a number of copies of paper ones, not real ones, or on virtual kinds of things. And these maps go all the way from our creation story, it might be 3-4 feet wide, through the Great Lakes, and then it gets to Lake Superior, and you can tell, because that's, I guess I can tell. But these maps, there's supposedly about 80 of these birch bark maps in existence, and they all, the ones I've seen, lead to Leech Lake. Leech Lake may very well be the center of the universe right by where I live. And so the way these maps work, and I'll just kind of talk about it backward, the Leech River is really the big river, the big water. The Mississippi River was a tributary to the Leech River, but because of the way non-Indians do their exploring and getting credit for finding the source of the river, they go and find something else. Well, the Mississippi was complex. And so one of our old reservations, Pokegama Lake in Grand Rapids, that's in Itasca County. Well, Itasca is the two words that are brought together. I think it's Greek and Latin or something. It means true source. Well, that wasn't the true source. And another 100 miles upstream, they decided that the true source of the Mississippi was at Itasca State Park, and they used the same name, even Itasca. So wild rice not only brought us to where we are, but in the sense of a spiritual covenant. And I was listening to Matthew Fletcher talk about it at the Indian Law Conference. And when you hear the real traditional parts of how we arrived on this planet, we are the last to arrive. Everything else is here. All the animals, all the birds, all the fish, all the plants, and the Creator has to petition all of creation to see if we're going to be permitted to live with it. So we might have acted bad in the past, maybe. I don't know. It might have been a second chance. But we have a covenant to be grateful for the food that gives us sustenance and makes us physical, corporal beings. And we have an obligation to protect those, because there are relations too. So when the word interconnectedness came up, I think more about that. Now, in that story, you know, however long ago wild ricing happened, you know, wild rice, almost all of us in the Ojibwe nation for sure, at one point or another, if you're around wild rice, learn how to harvest wild rice. I learned how to harvest wild rice. I've got my grandfather's old canoe. My grandfather got the canoe from his brother, Jim. You know, I've been out, you know, ricing with my dad. You know, I started out as a ricer. I started out as a puller. You start becoming a picker as you get better at all this. Well, as time went on, one of my cousins had a wild rice operation, and unfortunately, he died about 4 or 5 years ago, and he left it to me. Now, I was a little bit surprised in a way, but when you come back to the poverty of where we live, he probably figured I was the only one who could afford to operate the wild rice operation, because you have to be able to buy wild rice. And right now, green wild rice is probably $3.50 a pound. It takes 3 pounds of green rice to make 1 pound of finished rice. So you can be in to $7 or $8 a pound on wild rice just by buying it green. Then you have to process it and you have to finish it. Well, in the community where I live in Ball Club, pretty much that was the only processor available to the public. And so I have an obligation to also keep that alive and make it available for other people to process their rice. Otherwise, they just sell their rice and they don't get to have rice for themselves or for gifts for others or for ceremonies. Because if you don't know how to process rice or have a place, all you can do is sell what you picked. And so at the same time, my cousin, he also had a smoked fish operation, whitefish, best fish on the planet, maybe, you know, very high in omega-3 oil. And that is another one of those foods that you just wonder how you can live without once you've had it. And so when we have our rallies, our events, you know, with Winona and Honor the Earth and all, we bring smoked whitefish, we bring wild rice. We want people to understand what we value from the resources and how we share those things. And so, you know, rights of a fish would be another way to try to protect that water environment, because fish are our friends. They give us those same food sources. In our treaty journals, and this goes back to the Mille Lacs decision, but it applies to all the Chippewa. But in our treaty journals, you have wild rice as a treaty right, and then you have maple and fish, because those were the 2 other primary things we reserved as people of the water. And so in reality, when you put those 3 together, that means we need abundant, high quality, clean, pristine water that has not got a whole bunch of waste being dumped into it. And so that's why I'm trying to use our treaty rights with Monoma to keep our water as clean as possible, if we can prevent those things, and to keep our sources of food, whether it's the fish, whether it's the wild rice. I also like to duck hunt, you know, so you need to have all those aquatic resources right there available for everything to come in and pass through and enjoy. And so, you know, even though I'm an attorney and even though I'm very fortunate in those regards and, you know, get to help out in different ways in the community, I still have that basic on the ground obligation to make sure I'm participating in wild rice, that other people are getting wild rice. And the same with the smoked whitefish. I don't go out and catch those fish. I buy them from other Indians that go out and catch those fish. You know, I can't do everything. I don't need to do everything, but I know that smoking whitefish and finishing wild rice are very high on the priority list for all of us to have and understand. And so even though I don't need to be doing those things, and they are hard work, the rewards are just as important and the sharing is just as important. And so wild rice, you know, I've had it all my life. My grandfather always made sure all of his kids had wild rice and his grandchildren had some wild rice. So, you know, it's not foreign to me. And by creating the rights of Gnomon, almost every Chippewa or Anishinaabe or Ojibwe person already understands what the rights of Gnomon are. I don't have to explain it. They don't have to read the law because we already have it in us. You want to add something to that?
I don't add single thing more than what you shared, and I really appreciate that. Yeah, and I think it gives such depth and context to what a privilege it is to be able to eat it today, and knowing how challenging especially today, knowing how hard it is to get down to the final product that we get to eat now. So thank you for sharing that history. Related to, actually I'll pause again. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to come up?
Yeah, but if your question's related, if my question changes the topic.
I just had a quick food question.
Yeah.
Okay. So on the topic of food, Hillary, I had heard in another talk that you had given a quote that you shared about, in talking about food sovereignty, you mentioned if you control the food, you control the people. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connection between food sovereignty and tribal sovereignty and what you've done sort of in your work in that space.
Sure. I actually think usually when I do workshops with tribes, I usually serve food to exactly what you're doing right now. Because in talking about reciprocity, every single traditional food on a plate has a story. And there's general stories, family stories, and then maybe women's stories and the men's stories. So if anybody is honored to have somebody share their story with you, it's very special. And so, yeah, so I have a map that I usually use. I don't know, I probably can't share it, but so just with the westward expansion, right? Cutting off the buffalo supply, cutting off the intertribal trade network that, Frank talked about the Mississippi river system. All the river systems are highways, right, of intertribal trade across, transboundary lines. Our cultural boundaries are different than our political boundaries of today, which is sometimes hard for like the states to understand that, I'm sure, Patrick, you said you're part Tlingit, right? So there's Tlinkits in Canada too. So just so that the tribal worldview being completely different and dynamic and moving, right? So I'm from California, 109 federally recognized tribes. We have every single language group in California. So Patrick talked about the folks coming down in California. There was, we had a Russian fort. If you look at all the forts on the landscape, the forts were for the Indians. And so they were controlling the buffalo and all the traditional food. If you look at the Dakota Wars, the largest mass hanging was because of food. The folks were desperate to feed their families, right? Talking about the school to prison, pipeline in rural places in the Dakotas right now in Alaska. Part of that is the emasculation of the Native men, right? So it all goes back to the taking the external family and breaking the family down, which we're still living with the products of that today. Largely we think of the bison in the Central Plains, but the bison roamed out to Northeast California, all the way out to the Saki people. Like there was a lot of tribes that we don't think of as Buffalo Nation people, the Kickapoos and all these hunting parties. And then the reciprocity amongst the tribes, right? You bring your maple syrup in, can I hunt this herd? I want to make clothing and maybe have a name giving for my son, something like that, right? So just when you control our food sources, you have controlled us historically, And then even now, looking again, I know I used an example of the quarantine period, right? A lot of folks realized during this last couple of years that they did have food security issues, right? Whether or not you're in the inner city or you're out in rural spaces, access to water, right? Access to clean potable water, and the ability to travel.
Thank you.
Thanks again for y'all coming out today. It's been really amazing getting y'all's unique perspectives. As a student interested in energy litigation, I wanted to ask an energy-focused question. As society shifts from dependency on fossil fuels to use renewables for energy sources, whether it's crippling big oil or promoting clean energy or some other approach, what role do you see tribal rights playing in that shift? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be happy to take a stab at that one. I would have preferred to talk about food, but energy is fine too. When I worked for Secretary Udall, he was with a firm that did a lot of energy work, including FERC work, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission work. And at the time, one of the big issues was, what do you do with the spent plutonium? And at the time, it was going to tribal lands because tribes didn't have a whole heck of a lot of resources or authority, and there was money in being able to store some of that. So historically, there is also the role of, for example, the Navajo tribe, which provided a lot of coal, and basically got ripped off because they didn't have control over their own resources. So I think the first step is that we have greater control over our resources, which gives us opportunities that don't exist elsewhere. In Alaska, we don't have reservations, so we don't have that same kind of control over land, but it doesn't mean that we're not able to try and play a role in it, because we have huge stakes. As you know, Frank, I don't know if the rivers I don't know if the lakes are warming up. My guess is that they probably are, but Alaska is basically a lot of rivers: the Yukon River, the Kuskokwim, the Copper River, the Alsek. There are huge rivers that supply a lot of the wild salmon, and they are warming up. We need to begin to look at how we as Native people can facilitate the shift to energy. I know one of the issues that we're trying to face with a partial energy solution in Alaska is that many of you have heard of the ubiquitous honey bucket. It basically is a pail that you pee and poop in and then carry it to a place that you dispose of it in a lagoon. That can actually be converted into something called biochar, which a few tribes in Alaska are beginning to use and to look at, which in turn provides a source of carbon a source of charcoal that locks up carbon for a huge period of time. And in addition to that, is an amendment for soil that allows for growing crops. So it leads back to food security. So I would say that tribes have a huge role to play, but what I've observed is that we don't think anymore in terms of systems. I hear it coming out of Frank's mouth, and I think I hear it coming out of Hillary's, but we need to really say it again. When I was growing up, it was all about Mother Earth. It was all about not these silos that we belong to as a consequence of federal money and tribal recognition. It's really about relationships. So when we were talking about reciprocity, I know that, as Hillary mentioned, I'm Tlingit, but Athabascan country was in between my tribal house in Dry Bay, Yakutat, and the other tribal house in Klukwan, we went through Athabaskan country, so we intermarried into the Athabaskan. In Aleut country, we were right next to Copper River and to the Eyak Indians, so we married into them. And we knew and understood those relationships. We don't do that today. So what we really, I think, have to get back to is understand that we were a system because of our brown skin and because of our presence in North America. This was a system that Western Europeans decided to dismantle. And they did it in their own little way. And my arguments are that we need to begin thinking systemically to understand our relationships, to understand that, yes, we did have language, will not likely resurrect that, but the principles in my Tlingit world that language represented were respect. My tribal grandson, who was actually about 20 years older than I, told me of watching his grandfather, who belonged to one clan, having his speech vetted by his wife, who belonged to another clan, for any potential for slights, any potential for misunderstanding. Today, what I see in Indian country is that people actually aggressively look to slight and to offend other people unless they're in a public format, but behind the line. So if we get together and look at collaboration, cooperation, belonging to this big system, we should be making the decisions as in Indian country on how we want to begin shifting to an energy system that is beneficial to Mother Earth. And in terms of working within the energy field, it's a lot of that is understanding and trying to change the laws in a fashion that are beneficial. Sometimes adversarial, such as what Frank is talking about. He wants to get up and fight, and sometimes cooperative. So if you go into the Coachella Valley, leading in with Palm Springs, I see all of these windmills going in. I think some of them are on Indian land. And if they are, it is displacing a lot of carbon-based energy that is really friendly to the planet. So I'd love to hear the other perspectives as well from Midwest and California.
Thank you. Frank or Hillary, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Well, I can talk about it in a different way, and then maybe Hillary will clean it up for me. So, line 3, I talked about the judge that we drew because we had to sue the Corps of Engineers because we didn't get an EIS. And, that was in November of 2020, and Biden came in January of 2021, and, we thought, there'd be some kind of change, Jamie Pinkham, from out west there, he was at the Corps of Engineers. And what I've come to believe is that we're being sacrificed again in Indian country up here at the very tip top of the 3 of the 4 North America watersheds and the top of the Mississippi River, because we didn't get any respect from the Corps of Engineers or from the EPA. We didn't get an EIS. And right now, when you listen to the world, and I listen to it for my part, and everybody listens to it for their part, but people talk about green energy. They want to open mines in northern Minnesota. And in particular, they want to open one that's right along the Sandy Lake on the Line 3 corridor. And so my feeling is the feds didn't want to do an EIS for Line 3 because then they'd be stuck with the baseline of that EIS for the mining operation. And so because they have nothing in place, we still have no protection in place. At the same time, the governor wants to say, well, we'll let science lead. Science hasn't led. We had an EIS with the Public Utilities Commission. They said that the best thing to do was an inch-to-inch replacement of the pipe. The PUC, the political people who aren't tied to anybody, they said, no, we want to do what Enbridge does and give them a whole new route right through, rice country. And so we're being sacrificed for those resources, but we're being sacrificed for what they call the new green energy wave. And so I'm looking at still defending our water because of the mining industry in the same place as Line 3. And so as I create mechanisms under our right to travel and rights in Gnomon for water protectors to have their criminal trespass cases transferred to tribal court, you know, the one county that has both of those places in it, Aiken County, they are the most resistant because they're getting free money for a change. They've been one of the poorest counties in Minnesota forever. They said $2 million from Enbridge, we're going to get a new council room. We're going to get new chairs. They started their Christmas wish list in public in the newspaper, you know? So what does that tell us? We're sacrificed for their comfort. So they want to continue to beat up Indians, use rubber bullets, use their security guards, and continue to do their industrial operations. And the police want to continue to get the free money to beat us up and arrest us and charge us and try to get fines. Now, the interesting thing about some of this stuff also is as the tribal members are being transferred to some of them, not in all the counties, but some of them, it appears that the consequences for the remaining non-Indian water protectors are also being reduced, which is interesting because I felt the same thing out in Standing Rock. If you can't punish the Indians and you only got the non-Indians left, they don't like to punish the non-Indians, especially if you can't punish the Indians. So it gets kind of goofy. So when we talk about systems, you know, we have a clan system, and that was a lot of probably of what Patrick's talking about. And that's how we knew who our relations were. That's who we knew who our relations were when we showed up in a village. We didn't know anybody. That's how we knew who we could and couldn't marry. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things tied to that system. So one of the last things I just want to say about some of this stuff, because of the predicament that I'm in, and I have to continue these fights where I'm at that Indian Law Conference in Albuquerque a couple of weeks ago, when Matt was talking about those different things, he was also introducing a couple of speakers, and one of them was in there talking about the air quality and the other aspects. And I think Matthew was mad because whoever he was talking to, I don't remember the person's name, and he said, this guy's going to do a presentation on what's going on with global warming and greenhouse gases. And then he turned to him at the stage in front of 300 attorneys and said, so the number was effing 0 in January and February of 2021 because everybody was at home because of COVID. And so we have a system, we know how to fix the system. We can see that the system can be treated in a way that can reduce things, but it takes everybody not driving. It takes everybody not, you know, doing all those things. And it happened for a couple of months, but it's not going to be remembered, I don't think. And we're going to go right back to our old patterns. But it was really interesting to know that those numbers could be 0 for a couple of months just because a disease, a pandemic disease, scared us into staying home. So the future's hard to tell where we're going to get to, but I have no choice but to fight for the water and for the resources up here, you know, and, you know, I invite anybody else to come along. We got Line 5 going across Wisconsin. I think we're going to stop that one. We did stop the Sandpiper. Line 3, it was a replacement project. It was just, we couldn't keep it in its own corridor. And there's a lot of money spent, not on Indians. But so when I think about the Green Deal, I remember seeing on CBS Sunday Morning News that Talon and Elon Musk was looking for those precious metals. And he has already made a deal with Talon Mining right there at Sandy Lake. And so I'm having to fight Elon Musk, who can afford to go to space. David and Goliath, wild rice, power to the Gnomon.
I like that. I don't want to come up, like, what am I going to say to that? You know, I do want to, like, I know Patrick, I think, mentioned the wind turbines down in Palm Springs. Yeah, those are on the Agua Caliente Indian Reservation, and some of the Colorado River Indian tribes artists had like an installation of there, and I know if you're on social media, at some point you had to see it, but maybe didn't realize it was there, where it said like Indian country, like how the Hollywood sign is, it said Indian country and it was there. And so just because, what some people forget is that even if you don't realize like you're on an Indian reservation, like every single inch of our continent was walked upon. Somebody was there. Some valley, some stream is important to somebody that's living right now. And so as folks are on their way to Coachella, which the gray water actually goes to the Cabazon allotment for abatement from the Coachella Music Festival. Again, right back in Indian country, accepting waste and unknown garbage too. Huge garbage, like mountains down in the desert. So in California again, our reservations for the most part are postage stamp reservations, very small, hard to really do a lot. Palm Springs itself is a little bit different because it literally is a checkerboard. If you ever look at the land map, there's like exactly like a checkerboard where the black square is the Indian reservation. So they have so many very large leases where folks go down there on Bob Hope Drive and you want to retire, right? It's 100 degrees year round. So they have their own BIA agency down there and they receive so many leases. So like places like that, some tribes are able to do something different, but it's really like not common across Indian country. Like my reservation is way up in the redwood trees where the ocean, the redwood trees go into the ocean. So not a lot of sunlight for solar, not a lot of wind. For not a lot of year-round wind. We are near the Pacific Flyway, which is then you impact the birds, right? You have the turbines, or the bird blenders per se, right? Where the birds are going from Canada down to maybe Central or South America, and those birds are largely protected by international treaties. So it's interesting. And also on my mother's side, I'm Fort McDermott, Paiute, Shoshone tribes, one of the tribes where they're looking at a large lithium mine for our electronics, for our computers, for our phones. Even if you are quote unquote green, for the most part, you likely have a phone, right? With precious rare minerals in it. So all of our hands are empty, we're part of it. And so how do we do better, right? I know some tribal folks, I do work with some of the New England tribes, like the Mashantucket Pequot, and they say, there's no conservation. Why, even during quarantine, these large cities have all the lights on, and where is the energy coming from? What is the impact? Is it a dam that might not have a fish ladder, so it's affecting, migratory fish? Is it turbines? Is it nuclear? Is it a coal-fired plant, so it's affecting the air quality? Just being mindful of where our energy comes from, where our waste goes, where's our solid waste go, right? And does that affect our water quality, right? And the food that we eat, if we, take food from the streams or berries or anything near those sources. So I think the future has to include Indian country. I mean, that's the only way to do it. We're not going anywhere. And, there's tribal trust lands throughout the continent. And so some of our places are still relatively pristine. Of course, a lot of our national parks were from Indian country too, until relatively recently, until the tribal folks were ejected to create the parks like Yosemite, Yellowstone. But the future, I think we have to come together. Tribal people and other disadvantaged communities need to be involved, because I don't think we're going to get large scale buy-in for anything that will take shape, right? Is long lasting. For again, looking at the tribal worldview, long lasting, right? A couple hundred years in the future, we're making decisions that will likely not even directly affect us, but it's going to affect the great grandchildren down the road. So when you think of your decisions like that, it's different because those are people near and dear to your heart. Those are your nieces, your nephews, your greats out there. So when we make decisions, we have to include tribal nations. And now with the big push for TK, and it's only been 40-some years where a lot of tribes could openly even practice their native religion. And so now science is looking at including those folks. And unfortunately, a lot of the assimilation process in many aspects has been successful. And so how do we take that and move together forward? So like, I think we have, it's educating people. I know Frank, you mentioned DAPL a few times, and one of my friends was the TIPO for Standing Rock, and next month she graduates from UNM Law School, right? So getting folks out there that understand the issue, that are connected to community, that, become attorneys, become advocates, having allies that are true allies that don't want anything, they just want to help, that are there to use their connections, that are genuine, right? We all need genuine people in our lives. It's such a relief when you have genuine people, whatever it is, even if they have colorful language, but they're an advocate. Yes, I want you on my team. So our future is together.
That is a great segue, and I really can't think of a better final question for you all. Want to just be mindful of time. So before this final question, I just want to recognize that we have probably some additional questions. And so I'm wondering if it would be okay with the three of you, if there are additional questions, are you open to, we can sort of serve as a bridge connecting, relaying some questions if folks have follow-up that we didn't have time for today. Are you okay with that follow-up later? Okay, we'll get in touch. But I guess the final question that has come up a lot is in thinking about just how can the student community, our broader communities, how can we be greater allies in these different efforts and support, or if students and those tuning in want to learn more, do you have any final thoughts on how we can be greater allies, or where to start with learning more? And again, we're recording this, so we can always link to additional resources afterwards as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to put in my 2 cents worth, knowing that 2 cents is not worth a whole heck of a lot today. As Frank pointed out, we're older guys. I actually learned how to use computers when they were first coming out, and the internet when it was beginning to start to spread through the country, and have watched the power of communication, the power of thoughts and ideas that can spread quickly manifest itself. And I'm fortunate to have as a colleague a filmmaker, an Emmy award-winning filmmaker who got involved with Lower Elwha tribe and the dam that had been put up for hydroelectric power on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. That led to funding to be able to dismantle the dam, funding to be able to monitor it and try to encourage the few wild native salmon from that river to begin moving back upstream. It came from the power of social media, something that my sons grew up with. So I sit and fumble with my iPhone, mainly with fat thumbs. I don't understand that when when old guys join a platform, the young people start moving away from it. So it's a matter of following where the messages are going. And Robert Lundahl is showing me that. He talks about the idea of curation of ideas. You as, and the fact that you're in law school makes you privileged. The fact that you are privileged, that you are growing up in a digital age, that you now do research digitally. Us old guys had to learn how to use casebooks, had to learn how to use treatises, and go through and write it down on pen and paper. And it was difficult to get an idea spread that way. Now it's independent. So I would encourage each of you to use the skills that you already have to begin to send different thoughts and ideas out about Indian country, about Indian country engagement. I think that's the best thing that you can do right now, because your voice will be amplified if you do it correctly. And the curation of ideas, look up Dr. George Land, L-A-N-D, and the research he did with NASA back in the 1960s on innovation and creativity. Seek that innovation and creative gene. All of you, if you are products of the public school system, it has been taught out of you. What's going to happen in this curation of ideas is for you to become recreative and re-innovative and begin to connect thoughts and ideas. I say that because Dr. Land conducted research using the information he found out through NASA that demonstrated that 98% of our Head Start and kindergarten children in the late 1960s were basically geniuses of creativity and innovation. He followed with every 5 years to age 25 of those kids, over 200,000 of them, and found that only 2% retained any creative and innovative thinking ability. So use those two tools. Restore your creativity, restore your innovative thinking. You see two people who are doing that in front of you in Frank and Hillary, in connecting things in Indian country that will make a difference. Do the same thing. Connect thoughts and ideas that benefit Indian country, that benefit the planet, using the social media skills that you have grown up with to try and, well, turn the tide of media. You saw what one dysfunctional president could do on a Twitter account. Do the same thing, except using all of those other accounts. I just got introduced to WhatsApp because I have young friends. And you have that capability to introduce the generations of influencers. I haven't thought about Winona for a long time, Frank, but I hope she's got Twitter accounts and Instagram accounts and all of that other stuff, and has hired young people to manage them for her so she can get great ideas out there. So that's my thoughts and ideas. And, appreciate the opportunity to share them.
And Frank?
You're on mute. You're still on mute, Frank. There you go.
All right, Miigwech, yeah. So Patrick said a couple of things that made me flash back a little bit. You know, he talked about total quality and continuous improvement. And I did a lot of that back at the end of the 1990s with the state agencies I was working with. And you know, if you're not into continuous improvement, then you're kind of just off to the side of that other 98% that Patrick was talking about. And I also had a friend that worked at NASA, and he was reading a lot of the stuff that I was writing back around, I don't know, 2003, 4, 5. And he said, Frank, this is really good stuff. What are you doing to create your army? Well, right, it's communication. It's having people understand what your ideas are and having them ask questions. I find that the most important tool is someone asking me a question about something they don't understand, and that either I haven't explained it clear enough, or maybe they have an idea that they can't articulate, that I need to understand what the question is so I can look at my problem differently. And so I think a lot of that's the same way. I started out punching cards, sequencing cards, wiring boards for computers when I was young, you know, so I'm right there with you, Patrick. You know, as we get connected and we get more information, I was really glad when I went to that law conference. There were a lot of young law students who understood who I was and what I was doing. I don't know how they know it because I'm not plugged into Twitter. I don't use Facebook. I don't do any of that. But somehow or another, other people are watching what I'm doing. And I think it's the rights of nature, the rights of the Gnomon. And, you know, Hillary said something about that, you know, your genuine friends. You know, I go wherever I'm asked. That's why I'm here today, because people need to know there's a different way. They need to understand that you can't be indoctrinated and then be stuck in that box, because all you're going to get is the same result again as before. And so you have to figure out how to be changing the system, how to create a mechanism for social justice at times, and how to help other people understand what that might mean in their world. And so I've been lucky in that regard to work with other tribes that are trying to do this rights of nature. And I think it's going to be very helpful in a number of ways, whether it's the food security, the food sovereignty, or a cleaner world. But how we get to that place isn't very easy. But like Patrick was saying, the more we have this information age, the easier it was. And so just as a little side piece, and I know we're getting right here at 5 o'clock, when I was out trying to figure out things for Rosebud and KXL, and I was reminded of this with the checkerboard. You know, the Sioux, they've got checkerboard lands all over, not like the Chippewa, who they got all over territory at one time. And so they were going to run that KXL pipeline in between the trust parcels, in between the checkerboards on KXL reservation, not KXL reservation, but Rosebud. And so I was talking with the Rosebud people, and I was looking at what I could see from the outside on the internet, and it became apparent to me that they were kind of in the box with the other attorneys. And I had even been contacted by one of their attorneys with NARF about some land issues. And I told them, I said, you know, what I see is water is the issue. And then I started telling them about what I saw at Rosebud from Minnesota. And what I saw was Rosebud was providing the fresh drinking water for all 5 counties inside of its reservation. It was doing it unilaterally for 4 out of the 5 counties and in conjunction with one of the counties. And they were getting the water from the aquifer, for the Ogallala Aquifer and from Lake Ahi from the Missouri River. And so what that told me was they were the primary water jurisdiction inside their box, and that they were reporting the clean water drinking standards to the EPA. And when I helped them understand that water was their block, not land, because everybody who thinks that they have land, they can do what they want with it. Not everybody has water rights. We have water rights as Indians. We don't always know what they are. We don't always know how they're defined. But if we can use our water rights, I think it's going to make a lot more difference in a lot of places, because I live in a riparian area. So only the state, the federal government, and Indians have water rights. It changes the dynamic of what you're going to do in tribal court with your Gnomon law, you know? So I look at those kinds of pieces when I listen to what's going on. The communication age is it. You know, I've enjoyed talking to a lot of young law students, just like today, and being asked questions, because sometimes we need to be reminded of what the questions are instead of just what we think the answers are. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And Hillary.
Yeah, I know we're at time, but like for the law students, I just really think find what you're passionate about. And I know, of course, you know, land, air, water, cultural resources, but also if you're really good at GIS, you know, take all your other skills, because tribes could really use all those skills. And so, you know, and then, you know, Frank said, well, how do people know me? Well, if he knows Fletcher, probably on Turtle Talk blog, right? There's probably stuff out there. And so, you know, find those blogs, find the information. You know, Fletcher puts out, you know, some of the cases that's on Pacer. You could actually see the whole cases without paying for them. There's a lot of information out there. You know, as law students, you have to take, of course, the primary classes so you could actually, you know, pass the bar. But also, you know, don't forget what you're truly interested in too. Don't lose yourself. If you really are interested in relationships or family law or whatever it is, there's a place for you to be a great ally to, you know, tribes all over the country. And so just reach out, don't be shy. And, you know, we're out there and we need help.
Well, thank you so much, Chimigwe Chiakuke. Thank you again for being here, for sharing your time, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your experiences. It's so deeply appreciated. I'm sure there will be more questions, and it's really just been an honor and a privilege to share this time with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you again. Thank you all for being here. Please take some food home. Have a good night.